everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Hillary Stevens, and I'm with Restore America's Estuaries. I'd like to welcome you to this event about blue carbon, a nature-based solution for climate and coastal communities. We have a wonderful panel lined up today to talk about coastal blue carbon, and I look forward very much to diving right into it, but I've got some introductory remarks here that I'd like to make sure that everyone is familiar with the topic. And from there, we'll be hearing from Representative Suzanne Bonamici from Oregon, and then from our panelists. I'd like to welcome you all to this event. We are thrilled to be hosting in conjunction with the U.S. Climate Action Week. I encourage you to take a look at their website. There are events lined up all this week, and there's just a lot in store, so I encourage you to check it all out. And of course, have a wonderful Earth Day tomorrow. We have a large number of attendees with us here today, so everyone is on mute. I do hope at the end of the session we will have time to take questions, so I encourage you to put those into the question box in your control panel. This event will be recorded, and we'll be posting that on our YouTube channel and on our website. And with that, let me get right into our event here. Restore America's Estuaries is a national nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. We are a membership group, an alliance of 10 member groups that you see here on your map, located around the continental US. They are working in their local areas to protect and restore their bays and estuaries. And we serve as an advocate and a convener for them, and indeed for anyone working in their coastal area around the country. We have a number of different programs in living shorelines and water quality, of course, in blue carbon, and we host a biennial national summit about all things coastal. And if you're interested in more information about our programs, I encourage you to take a look at our website, estuaries.org. Today, we're here to talk about blue carbon. What exactly is blue carbon? The term refers to the greenhouse gases that are stored in, sequestered by, and released from coastal marine ecosystems, such as seagrasses, mangroves, and salt marshes. And our goal is to encourage public and private investment in protecting, conserving, and restoring these valuable habitats. This cartoon drawing is a loose imagining of the carbon cycle and how it works in these coastal ecosystems. You see here mangroves on the left, and then salt marshes and seagrasses on the right. And of course, they would not actually be growing this close to each other, but this is just a mock-up. These are true plants, which means they are rooted in the soil, and that they use photosynthesis to derive energy and to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and use it to build up their tissues. So these plants are taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sometimes from the water around them. They use it through the process of photosynthesis to build their woody stems, their leaves, and their blades. And as that tissue dies, it falls to the bottom. And because these tend to be very sediment-rich systems, that material is buried quickly and ends up being trapped in the soil. And because those soils are inundated with brackish and salt water, it's an anoxic environment, and the carbon does not readily break down. That leads to it being stored in those soils for a very long time, decades, and in some cases, centuries. As long as those systems remain undisturbed, that carbon can be stored. And because that process of moving so quickly from the plant matter into the soils, it makes these systems that are so productive, also per unit area, much more effective at sequestering carbon than upland forest systems. However, these systems in many cases are rapidly being lost through the process of development, through degradation, being drained. It's estimated that in the US, the draining of wetlands can emit up to 2 million tons of CO2 per year, because that carbon is buried and sequestered in that soil. But if that soil is drained and air can get in, then that carbon that was trapped in that soil because it was anoxic can break down and be re-released again. Wetland erosion and loss to open water is estimated to emit up to 7 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. So these systems that are so effective at sequestering carbon when they're in their natural and productive state can actually become carbon emitters if they are lost to degradation or drainage. There are many ways that we can take action to protect the coastal wetlands that we already have and to restore and even create new ones. And all of these activities will lead to the greenhouse gas sequestration benefits that I have just described. So that is a big part of Ray's efforts in this blue carbon sector. From here, I'd like to introduce our 4 panelists. But before I turn it over to them, we're going to watch some introductory remarks from Representative Suzanne Bonamici, who is from the state of Oregon. Her office has been responsible for some very proactive legislation, codifying the federal approach to blue carbon. And we are very appreciative of her taking the time to give us these remarks today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici from Northwest Oregon, and I'm honored to co-chair the House Oceans Caucus and Congressional Estuary Caucus. Thank you all for being here and for your dedication to taking bold climate action to protect our planet. Every person on this planet benefits from a healthy ocean. Earth is fundamentally a blue planet. The ocean covers more than 70% of the planet's surface. It supplies much of the oxygen we breathe and regulates our climate. It's linked to the water we drink, and it's home to more than half of all life on the planet. The ocean drives our economy, feeds, employs, and transports us. The power of its waves generates clean energy. It buffers the harmful effects of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, but for too long, the ocean has been taking the heat for us. As we move forward, the ocean must be a central part of the climate solution. Last year, I joined my colleagues on the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis in releasing a bold, science-based, comprehensive climate action plan to set our nation on a path to net zero emissions no later than mid-century and net negative thereafter. I'm thrilled that our plan recognizes that we can capture the power of the ocean to mitigate the climate crisis, including blue carbon. Healthy blue carbon ecosystems like mangroves, tidal marshes, seagrasses, and kelp forests can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it for centuries to millennia in stems, branches, roots, leaves, and soils. According to the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, the protection and restoration of blue carbon ecosystems could prevent approximately 1 gigaton of carbon dioxide from entering the atmosphere by 2050. We must restore our coastal ecosystems and recognize their value as an effective climate mitigation strategy. In the coming weeks, I will be reintroducing my Blue Carbon for Our Planet Act, a bipartisan bill to strengthen blue carbon research and support the conservation and restoration of these ecosystems so we can maximize this effective carbon sequestration tool in our fight against the climate crisis. Specifically, the bill will create a national map and inventory of coastal blue carbon ecosystems and their sequestration potential, study the effects of climate change and other environmental stressors on the rates of carbon sequestration, improve protections for existing coastal blue carbon ecosystems, and restore and expand degraded ecosystems. But protecting blue carbon ecosystems cannot be limited to a single piece of legislation. There is tremendous potential if we reframe our definition of infrastructure to consider more than just roads and bridges and include meaningful investments in coastal restoration and resilience. Our ocean and coastal communities are changing rapidly, and we must act soon. Thank you again for your leadership on these issues. I look forward to our continued work together.
Again, I want to thank Representative Bonamici for making those remarks with us today. And from there, we will move on to our first panelist, who is from her office. This is Maxine Sugarman, who serves as Environment and Labor Policy Advisor for Congresswoman Bonamici. She leads the Congresswoman's work on the Space, Science and Technology Committee, the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and has supported the Congresswoman's work in drafting legislation related to ocean acidification, algal blooms, hypoxia, blue carbon, marine debris, ocean data and monitoring, and clean energy. We are very happy to have with us today Maxine Sugarman. So Maxine?
Thanks so much, Hillary, and thanks to the entire team at Restore America's Estuaries for organizing today's event and for all of your work on blue carbon. As Hillary mentioned, I work for Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici from Northwest Oregon, and I'm sorry that we were having some technical issues with her video today, but we can make sure to follow up and provide a copy to everyone who's joining. For those of you who are not familiar with Northwest Oregon, the northern boundary of the Congresswoman's district is the Columbia River, and the western boundary is the Pacific Ocean. And as a result, many of her constituents are directly on the front lines of the climate crisis. They've been devastated by harmful algal blooms following the warm blob off the Pacific coast in 2014. Hypoxia has basically become a seasonal issue for our region. And we've also heard a lot from the shellfish industry and Northwest tribes about how ocean acidification and coastal acidification have really devastated their communities and their livelihoods. In 2018, the Congresswoman first introduced her Coast Research Act, a comprehensive bipartisan bill to address ocean and coastal acidification. And the bill actually passed the House unanimously in June of 2019, but then stalled in the Senate. And as the Congresswoman was working on the bill, we were really hopeful that the legislation could point to a specific mitigation strategy. We had been learning about some research at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center about the potential of seagrasses to help mitigate ocean acidification. And we were really excited about the opportunity to help buffer the effects of the climate crisis on the ocean. Ultimately, we decided that the research was still in its infancy and we couldn't point to it definitively in the bill just yet, but the tremendous potential of these coastal ecosystems really stuck with us. And about a year later, the Congresswoman was visiting with former NOAA administrator and now Deputy Director for Climate at OSTP, Dr. Jane Lumchenko. And they were having some really detailed conversations about how we could transition the narrative on ocean and the climate crisis and reframe it from this idea that the ocean is taking the brunt of our inaction to instead trying to focus on the opportunities for capturing the power of the ocean itself to help mitigate the climate crisis. We received a preview of the IPCC's special report on the ocean and the cryosphere and realized that we really needed to emphasize the potential of the ocean as a mitigation tool. And around the same time, the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy released its really tremendous research paper highlighting 5 opportunities to advance ocean climate solutions. And notably, it emphasized the need to map blue carbon ecosystems. The Congresswoman was working with her colleagues on the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis to develop a comprehensive climate action plan, about 500 pages of detailed policy recommendations to reach net zero emissions no later than mid-century and net negative thereafter. And we were hearing a lot about the potential of terrestrial ecosystems and the need to preserve and protect forest health and soil as a natural climate solution. But we weren't hearing as much about blue carbon and its potential to prevent 1 gigaton of carbon dioxide from entering the atmosphere by 2050. And in addition to ocean acidification, we know that these ecosystems can also provide habitat for our fisheries and improve water quality and protect our shorelines from sea level rise. So all of this led us to start conversations with many of the folks on this panel today to draft a bill, now known as the Blue Carbon for Our Planet Act, which the Congresswoman will actually reintroduce with her colleagues tomorrow. And the purpose of the bill is to establish a structure within NOAA to develop a map and inventory of blue carbon ecosystems, strengthen protection for existing blue carbon ecosystems, restore and expand degraded ecosystems through a new pilot program, and provide for the long-term stewardship of coastal blue carbon data. So we're really excited to see so much interest and engagement and hope that this is only the first of many blue carbon bills to come. But this isn't the only opportunity for federal enhancements in blue carbon ecosystems. And another one that the Congresswoman has been working on is working to secure about $10 billion in investments in coastal restoration and resilience projects as part of the President's upcoming American Jobs Plan. And this work is modeled on NOAA's efforts following the Recovery Act in 2009, and not only has the potential to create really good paying jobs in coastal communities, but is also a useful tool in scaling up blue carbon sequestration. So we look forward to your questions today and appreciate the really strong interest in these issues. And thank you again to Restore America's Estuaries for inviting me and the Congresswoman to participate today.
Thanks, Maxine, so much. Our next panelist is Emily Pidgeon. Dr. Emily Pidgeon is the Vice President of Ocean Science and Innovation at Conservation International, which is focused on solutions for coastal and marine adaptation to climate change and on developing marine-based approaches for mitigation through blue carbon. She founded the Blue Carbon Initiative and is co-chair of the International Blue Carbon Scientific Working Group. So Dr. Pidgeon, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Hillary. It's really rewarding to hear the work that Congresswoman Bonamici is bringing and is introducing that bill tomorrow, because it's another step along a pathway that started for me and some of the other panelists we have today a decade ago. And in that time, or at that time a decade ago, those of us outside the sort of specialized academic community were just beginning to understand how important these coastal wetland ecosystems, the mangroves, the seagrasses, and the salt marshes are, and how important they were as dense carbon stores, and how highly efficient they are at storing carbon within these ecosystems. And since then, in that 10 years, the science describing the climate value of these ecosystems has evolved. But the challenge for myself and for many people since then, in that 10 years, is how do we integrate these conservation and restoration of these ecosystems, these blue carbon ecosystems, into the sort of range portfolio of climate change solutions that are critical right now for addressing the climate crisis. And through the Blue Carbon Initiative, which we brought together a very broad and diverse community that has focused on integrating this ongoing blue carbon science into climate policy and climate finance. And so that our challenge in that decade has, first of all, to bring awareness as to the importance of blue carbon as a key component of climate, of the climate solution. But we've also had to grapple with ensuring that the science that we're doing is actually answering the questions that policy needs answered to move this forward as a real solution. And then we've had to use this science as a foundation for building the tools and the practical mechanics necessary to make blue carbon a solution that has impact on the ground. Now we're beginning to see some real leadership in actually doing this, in actually using these tools. At the Paris Climate COP, 6 years ago, Australia launched the International Partnership for Blue Carbon, which brings together governments and organizations from around the world to advance blue carbon as a climate solution. This year, we saw Costa Rica build blue carbon very fundamentally into its nationally determined contribution to achieving the Paris Accord. Fiji is now working on including blue carbon in its greenhouse gas inventories. And in Colombia, we're just about to see the very first carbon credits produced out of mangroves using methodologies that were very specifically designed for blue carbon ecosystems. And this is a partnership between Conservation International, the government of Colombia, and Apple. And so that's very exciting to see these pieces come together. And these are just a very few examples of how blue carbon has gone from being an interesting, important scientific concept to something that's actually beginning to cause change on the ground for the communities that live amongst these ecosystems, but then also to have an impact for all of us in terms of addressing climate change. I think there's two main lessons that I have found from the evolution of blue carbon along that decade, and that is that it takes a village. It's been a very large, very diverse community effort, spanning policy, spanning many disciplines of science to bring all this together. And we still have a lot of work to do. And then I think also that science is essential, but science has to be developed in partnership with policy and management and not in isolation. And those have been the fundamental lessons, I think, that we've learnt along the way as blue carbon develops. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Emily. We appreciate your remarks. The next panelist that we're going to hear from today is Tanya Marie Surgeon Rogers. She is the manager at the Wacoit Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Trained as a scientist, science translator, stakeholder engagement specialist, and project manager, Ms. Rogers works to develop and provide training and technical assistance to decision makers on coastal issues such as climate change, water quality, nutrient pollution, and eutrophication. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Hillary, for the invitation, and I just wanted to echo my thanks to Restore America's Estuaries for putting together this panel, and for my fellow panelists here sharing their wisdom and expertise with you this afternoon, and to the audience for joining us, for your interest in the topic. I think having listened to both Maxine and Emily, that you're going to hear some similar themes echoed through the conversation today, because we're all coming at this from different angles, but having a shared experience, having worked on this topic and in this space for, as Emily said, over a decade now. I am coming to this from the National Estuarine Research Reserve family. I work at the Wacoit Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve that's based in Massachusetts on Cape Cod. And about a decade ago or so, we began a partnership with scientists, with stakeholders working at the national, state, and local levels to really look at blue carbon as a solution for addressing some coastal water quality issues, and also looking at coastal resilience issues at the time. And stepping back and looking now at 10 years later and seeing where we have come in terms of the community at large working on this topic, it's really fascinating to just pause and to say a lot has happened in that decade, really a lot. And we had, as it were, a dream, a vision then, that this kind of conversation like we're having today would be would be born out of the science and out of the work that we were doing collaboratively. And we set out to really use a collaborative research paradigm that brought together scientists, not just working on interesting scientific questions, but thinking about the policy and management implications and how to really do that integration in a way that was substantive. And so I think the same lesson that Emily just talked about is the same lesson that I have seen in our journey. And the project that I'm referring to that spanned about a decade, it had happened over 2 phases. It's called Bringing Wetlands to Market. And some of the panelists that are here today also participated in the vision for that in the beginning, and also in carrying forward the work. And the NERS, not just Wacoit Bay, have served in this decade as platforms for research on blue carbon. And I think that it is important to have places around the country where the science can happen in a way, and where there are people that are placed in the community, a place-based approach to really looking at where the science has applications on the ground to real coastal management and policy. So there, you can be talking about this topic from the international level, also from the national level. You heard about the policy implications and really exciting developments there, but also at the local level to make this topic relevant to local communities and to their resilience and sort of restoration of degraded ecosystems. And so at the Wacoit Bay Reserve, and as part of the Bringing Wetlands to Market project, and I really want to call out and value my colleagues who worked on that project, because so much was brought to the table from just spearheading that project over time. And my role on the project was really to work as what we call a collaborative lead, really working in the space of trying to make the link between the science community, the research investigators, and the stakeholders, the decision makers who could really use that science, but also bring the questions to the table that the scientists would then fold into their research portfolio. And that truly happened over the decade that we worked together. A few of the things, I could make a lot of points today, but a few of the things that really stood out of this decade of work that I think would have application more broadly, and we're seeing it integrated in sort of the bill that was talked about earlier and beyond, is that, you know, through the science and the work at the local level, we were able to pinpoint how much there is a climate mitigation benefit from restoring the impaired hydrology and restoring degraded ecosystems that have either been drained or impounded over time. In the New England landscape, we have so much of our salt marshes that have been, you know, the hydrology has been impaired somehow. And through the research, we learned that there could be such a strong climate mitigation gain if we were to think about just focusing on even just that, restoring hydrology, restoring the functions that these natural ecosystems play that both Hillary, Maxine, and Emily introduced. If we were to allow those natural ecosystems, bring them back to a format where they are being able to function as they were naturally intended to do, they would be doing that job of sequestering carbon and continuing to contribute to our climate mitigation gains here. And this was a real huge lesson. And the reason why these ecosystems are so powerful at doing that is that when we do impair the hydrology, we're moving them from being, to become more freshened. And by doing that, we change the whole sort of microbiological community activity in the soil, and eventually we're causing these ecosystems to move from being sinks to being sources of greenhouse gases, such as a potent gas like methane and also carbon dioxide. So thinking about the application regionally and across different spheres and around the country from what could be gained from restoring hydrology of disconnected ecosystems is a real opportunity here. The other thing that we've learned through this process is that part of our project had an angle where we were trying to create the tools and methodologies for blue carbon ecosystems to be considered in carbon markets. And I won't have time to go into all of the work that went beyond that, but just to say methodologies that would allow these ecosystems to be discreetly and pointedly connected with carbon market applications. But on the other hand, we also work with our stakeholders to really unpack and realize that even the market applications component were innovative. We should definitely go after them. There's so many benefits that could be gained from that to drive investment in restoring these ecosystems. And so that was the hook of using a carbon market angle and trying to explore how can these ecosystems be considered through this avenue. But we learned that while the markets could deliver investment, and we're still working on that activity is still happening, both at the voluntary level and at the compliance in compliance markets. There's still a lot of work happening. It's been slow, but it's also been exciting. On the other side of that is that even without market application, there's so much benefit in recognizing and thinking about the benefits that these ecosystems provide and start to intentionally consider them in greenhouse gas inventories at the state level, start intentionally considering them in sort of project management approaches, really bringing that blue carbon benefit to the fore and recognizing that whatever we do on both developing a state climate action plan or restoring degraded ecosystems, it's not just about the blue carbon piece, but adding in that blue carbon ecosystem service bolsters those projects. It brings to fore the value of these ecosystems and counts their contribution and looks at what kind of specific activities can be done to restore them where they have been degraded and to protect them where they need to be protected so that they're not going to fall into the same cycle as those that have been degraded over time. And so I think those two lessons, thinking about the market applications, and while we're working on that front, also thinking about, even without the market contributions, thinking about the greenhouse gas benefits that can be realized at the state level. Now, having said that, there's a lot that needs to go into assisting states with actually doing that function. They need the science, they need tools, they need expertise and resources and people to be able to do that. And if you take each of those points, you're going to need to really bring scientists to the table who can work hand in hand with state policymakers to understand what's happening. You need the mapping to be done for states to understand what their blue carbon ecosystems are doing, where they are, which ones have been degraded, which ones have really high restoration potential, and help the decision makers to sort of work through the policy implications of that. But it's exciting to see that happening. We're beginning to have those conversations in Massachusetts. I know there are many other states where this is bubbling up and starting to really take root. So you can see those connection points happening at both the national level, connected with happening at the state level, and then for local projects also coming into consideration. And then, so I don't go over my time too much, the other point I wanted to make is that I think another lesson is that there is a huge education and a challenge here, as well as an education opportunity. There is so much that has been learned over the past decade, and we can see when we started this work, if you said the word blue carbon, not many people would understand what was meant by that. Today, that has completely changed, but there's still a lot of work to be done on the ground in our local communities, as well as at the state level where I work all the time, to continue to build that knowledge base and continue to act as conveners of both the scientists and managers working together on thinking about this topic. And so that's the space that I've been working in, the National Estuary and Research Reserve System has been working in. And one of the things that we've really been intentional about doing is thinking about that collaborative research paradigm, not just about the topic we're doing, but how we go about doing this work, that it needs to be integrated. It needs to be collaborative. It needs to bring these different spheres of expertise coming together. And out of that, the innovation happens, the rethinking happens, the birth of new policies and new approaches is happening right now on the ground. And I think that that is one point that I would emphasize, that it has been such a terrific process to watch, and it has so many benefits that needs to carry forward in whatever we do, both at the national and state and local levels on this topic. And with that, I'm going to rest and wait for the rest of the panelists to give their comments, and I'm happy to be a part of the conversation. Apologize for the technical difficulties.
Thank you so much, Tanya Marie. And without ado, I'll move on to our fourth panelist. This is Steve Crooks. He is the principal for wetland science and coastal management at Sylvestrum Climate Associates. He's a wetland scientist and geomorphologist with experience in the response of coastal wetland systems to human impacts and climate change. He was the lead author of the IPCC 2013 Wetland Supplement, and he leads the U.S. Coastal Wetland Carbon Working Group, incorporating coastal wetlands within the U.S. inventory of greenhouse gas emissions and sinks. Steve, on to you.
I'm going to keep my comments short so we can get to discussion, but I'm going to provide an opinion, I guess, based upon private practice. You know, where do we see all of this going? And you know, really, in the last 10 years, we've gone through a process of sort of raising awareness, as Emily was talking about, and Tanya Marie were talking about, and building an enabling environment. But where we are right now, you know, the engagement from the science and policy community has been fantastic. We see blue carbon ecosystems featuring prominently in a lot of national NDCs, nationally determined contributions, the response to the Paris Climate Agreement. And we're seeing countries and subnational states are now exploring a whole range of funding mechanisms for conservation and restoration of blue carbon ecosystems. An important step really was the IPCC producing the guidance to include coastal wetlands in national greenhouse gas inventories, because this becomes a mechanism and a driver for countries to think more about the role of their blue carbon ecosystems and the improved management of it, and what they can do to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and what policies are required. Countries are applying this guidance, and in fact, by 2024, all countries where wetlands are significant need to be applying the wetland supplement. These methodologies are connected to improving, there have been improvements in methodologies connecting blue carbon ecosystems to the carbon market, primarily through the verified carbon standard and the development of a conservation methodology and a restoration methodology for these ecosystems, and at the small scale with Plan Vivo. And countries are exploring the inclusion of blue carbon ecosystems under their own national systems, which is very promising. Carbon finance projects have been slow to appear, but have started to come online. They've gone from being very small village scale projects to projects to scale at which Emily was talking about. We've been helping the Sindh government in Indus Delta Capital with a project in the Indus Delta, which will hopefully enable the planting of 1 billion mangrove trees over 350,000 hectares. That's about 700,000 acres of reforestation in the Indus Delta, incorporating bringing clean water and medical services to 14 villages within that area. And so we're starting to see real activity starting to move forward. There's been a huge level of interest from the private investment sector, from companies, from insurance industries, from across the board, all of a sudden within the last year, really. And this now outstrips the pipeline of projects. And so we're seeing a real appetite And I think one of the things that's changed is that we're seeing people, investors moving from just wanting to buy credits to now wanting to engage in early project development and bring new projects online and thinking longer term. It's interesting also that we're seeing the price of carbon credits potentially increase when we look at these projects which are coming up on sale. And now the price is higher than the support that would be provided under international jurisdictional programs like RED mechanisms. And so that's very encouraging, but still the price is below the social cost of carbon. We've seen major advances in tools such as monitoring, remote sensing, and standardized methods for MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification. And increasingly, we're seeing linkages between land management and the ocean. In Alaska, for instance, Kachemak Bay and NER are looking at opportunities for coastal peatland conservation and how that links to the salmon industry and the role for carbon financing in underpinning that. In the Pacific Northwest in Oregon, the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group and Pew have been helping to inform the Oregon Global Warming Commission on the role of restoration in terms of greenhouse gas management and how it's been thought about in terms of natural and working lands policies. And Tanya Marie told us about the activities going on in New England, and there are other activities going on in North Carolina. So where next? There is a need to develop a pipeline of projects. Projects are insufficient for the financing that's out there and the demand for really reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Not all projects are going to be good projects for carbon financing. So there's a need to maintain rigor in analysis and due diligence of project opportunities. That said, all restoration projects are good. And in the long term, they're good for carbon reductions, but in the short term, some of the fresher marshes, restoring them is not going to lead to a net greenhouse gas benefit. But all restoration opportunities are valuable, and because space is limited, all restoration opportunities should be made the most of. There will be continued exploration of non-carbon finance market mechanisms. We're seeing a growth in subsidy approaches, links to adaptation funding, the application of green bonds, blue bonds, and all sorts of blended finance mechanisms which are being applied. And finally, there's exploration in including other coastal ecosystems under the blue carbon banner, and we potentially under the carbon markets, we'll start to see the development of seascape management approaches as an extension or corollary to the way landscape and management actions have been developed on the terrestrial environment. So watch this space, because we may start to see finance mechanisms for seaweed farming, possibly kelp conservation restoration, even possibly avoided seabed trawling. And so let's see how they develop. It requires science, but there's definitely a lot of interest in moving those forward and connecting them to finance and policy. And with that, I'll close for now, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve. That's a great balance to some of the other perspectives we've gotten. If I'd like to welcome back all of the presenters, go ahead and put your cameras on, and I'm going to start the Q&A portion here. We do have some questions coming in. The first one, actually I have a comment. Someone is asking, can we please refer to coastal blue carbon as opposed to just blue carbon to make sure that we're differentiating between coastal and ocean systems? And that is absolutely a valid point. I think some of us that work in this space, blue carbon just rolls off the tongue, but you're absolutely right that what we're talking about in this space are coastal systems, and we probably could be more specific there. And another question, all the presenters talk about blue carbon and blue carbon ecosystems broadly, but there are a lot of nuances and variations on storage and sequestration rates among habitat types. Can you please address the spectrum of the difference and which ones are the most advantageous when it comes to storage? Emily, I'll throw that one to you.
All right. Well, Steve is our data expert, so I'm going to ask him to follow up with me. But of the three main coastal blue carbon ecosystems that have received the most focus, which is the mangroves, salt marsh, and seagrasses, the mangroves and salt marshes definitely have variations in the amount of carbon. Often the coastal geomorphology or the conditions along the coast, including sort of whether there are freshwater streams or other nearby ecosystems can often change the amount of carbon that we see in these ecosystems. Different regions have higher levels of productivity that change, but they tend to be comparable in the amount of carbon in those ecosystems. The seagrasses have much more variability. They can actually go from having not much to very high levels of carbon in them. And the key factor here is not just how much carbon is stored, but what the capacity is of these ecosystems to sequester. And both the salt marshes and the seagrasses can have be very efficient at sequestering carbon continuously for long terms, even potentially millennia. I don't know, Steve, would you like to follow up?
Yeah, just to add, from an avoided emissions and conservation point of view, all blue carbon systems are important, because when you convert them to something else, you lead to an emission irrespective of the type of blue carbon ecosystem. From a restoration point of view, the methane in the fresher environments offsets a lot of the carbon sequestration within the decadal timescale. So that puts an emphasis from a carbon management point of view on maybe the seagrasses, the salt marshes, mangrove systems, but also coastal forests, what we might see in the Pacific Northwest or maybe down in the Gulf, where the methane and carbon maybe net out in the soil, but the biomass in the trees sequesters for decades to come. And when we think about the restoration activities, there's been a lot of focus on emergent marshes, but in Washington State, 60% of the estuaries used to be coastal forest, and there hasn't been a focus on restoring that ecosystem. And from an adaptation point of view, there's a lot you can do with restoring coastal forest, both in creating space for habitat to move into in the future, creating habitat which becomes tidal forest in the future, and also just restoring the fisheries part, because tidal forest is incredibly important. So I would throw that one into the mix and just recognize the value of that also.
And if I could just add,
please go ahead, Maxine.
Yeah, I think just from a policy perspective, I think that's one of the reasons that the Congresswoman's bill tries to map and create an inventory of these ecosystems, so that we can have the full range and understanding when we're looking, like Steve was saying, at where should we be restoring Washington State versus other regions in the Pacific Northwest to get the highest potential for carbon sequestration.
And we certainly appreciate the emphasis in the bill on supporting the data clearinghouse, making sure that information is well curated and available to the people who need it. All right, questions are pouring in, so I'm going to move on. What is the role of state governments, particularly in factoring blue carbon into their greenhouse gas calculations? Tanya Marie, I know you work with the state of Massachusetts sometimes. Do you want to take a stab at that? I'm afraid I'm not getting your audio. Oh, shoot, I'm so sorry. Steve, do you want to take a jump in at that, and I'll see if I can get Tanya Marie's audio up?
Sure. The states really have a very important role, and at the national level, the EPA provide greenhouse gas accounting, and of course the federal level provide a lot of funding and a lot of guidance that set the tone for a lot of activities that occur across the US. But also the role of the states is so important about what happens on the ground on their own territories, and so really, with states looking to manage their own coastal wetlands, I think that really is a critical role. When we look overseas, states, yeah, maybe I'll just leave it there. I think the role of the states is as important, if not more important, than what we see at supernatural levels.
Maxine, I know you focus at the federal level. Do you ever work in conjunction with the state governments?
Yeah, I think Steve previewed this in his introductory comments, but I think Pew and a handful of other stakeholders, including the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group, are working with Oregon Department of Land and Conservation Development right now on their climate adaptation framework, and that's been really promising to see. I think we might also see more engagement as President Biden's executive order on 30 by 30 protections comes into play, and what that means for state protections to match some of the federal targets.
Okay, here's a great question. Someone writes in, I'm a senior in college and I'm very interested in the science and conservation work you all are doing. What opportunities are there in this field for a young scientist who wants to have an impact on the climate crisis? We got a fresh face coming in. Where should we send them?
I think that we've done a lot, but there's a huge need to bring in more people, and I think the key here, which we were just talking about with the states, is being able to take the science, work with policymakers, and then actually translate that into conservation and restoration on the ground. And it's being able to sit between those two. Maxine and the staff in Congresswoman Bonamici's office have been incredibly nimble at learning the science, and we scientists have to be nimble at learning the policy. And so I would suggest being a young scientist who then does a fellowship or really learns to speak policy at the same time is a key set of skills that we need.
And it sounds like communication skills, right? Whichever side of that you sit on, learn how to talk to people that are around the table. Anyone else want to chime in there? What courses would you recommend?
I can't speak to courses, but I would just add, find the piece that you're really passionate about, because the climate crisis can get so overwhelming and it's hard to break it down and try to come up with some tangible solution that you want to work towards at times. So find that intersection of your personal passion and what can drive you forward.
And I might just add, join community groups as well, Project Downdraw and others, because community is such an important part of this. And so, where you can, link in and speak up.
Tanya Marie, did you want to give your audio another shot? No, I'm so sorry. Okay, I want to thank all of our panelists for being here today and for their insight and remarks, and to thank all of our attendees and for bearing with us with some technical glitches today. The technical fates were not with us, I'm afraid, but thank you again, and I want to wish everyone a very happy Earth Day tomorrow. And please do take advantage of all of the events that are being scheduled this week. Go and check out the U.S. Climate Action Week website. There are a lot of things going on through the evenings as well. So please take advantage of that. Have a wonderful day tomorrow. And thank you everyone again for being out here today.